In this lesson, we're continuing our discussion of molecular structure by adding the topic of hybridization, and we'll talk about how central atoms in molecules can be hybridized. Well, if we look at this molecule here, CH4, that's the compound methane, we'd find that its Lewis structure looks something like this. It has carbon as its central atom, and it's single bonded to 4 different hydrogen atoms, and so essentially that's the structure for the methane molecule. But if we think about this from the standpoint of electron configurations, it seems that there's a problem with that structure. For example, if we think about the electron configuration of carbon, and so we see where carbon is on the periodic table, you might remember that it has 4 valence electrons. The 1s2 electrons are not valence electrons, but carbon does have 2s2 and 2p2 as valence electrons. And so if we plot those on an orbital diagram, we have 2s with 1 orbital and 2p with 3 orbitals, and the 2s electrons are paired up, and the 2p electrons look like this. And so from this standpoint, it looks like there are only 2 unpaired electrons in carbon. So it seems like there are only 2 electrons that would want to pair up with anything else. So from the standpoint of electrons, it sure looks like carbon only is going to make 2 bonds instead of the 4 that we see over here in the actual structure. So what's happening? Well, CH4 exists, obviously, and so something is happening here. Well, this is something called hybridization. Now, if we can imagine this, perhaps we can imagine that one of those electrons right there, that maybe that 2s electron, is somewhat promoted to 2p. So we have this right here. Now we have 4 unpaired electrons, and so we can have 4 bonds. But something happens. We don't have 1 s bond and 3 p bonds. What happens is these 4 orbitals undergo something called hybridization. They basically hybridize, and we have 4 identical hybridized orbitals. And so they're all identical. They're not really s orbitals, and they're not really p orbitals. They're hybridized, part s and part p. It's like if you have some milk and you want to have some orange juice, and so maybe you have half of a cup of milk and you mix it in with half a cup of orange juice. You have a super drink with calcium and vitamin C that tastes disgusting too. Well, this is what we have here. These are hybridized orbitals. They're 1 part s and they're 3 parts p. And so we call this sp3 hybridization. And so we can say that methane has hybridized orbitals. Those orbitals are 1 part s and 3 parts p. And so we say it has sp3 hybridization. And once again, these are 4 identical hybridized orbitals. 1 part s and 3 parts p. So we would say that in the methane molecule, and here's its basic structure, that central atom, that carbon atom, has this sp3 hybridization. It's always the central atom that undergoes this hybridization process. If an atom does not have a central atom, there is no hybridization. Now, you can have an atom with several central atoms, and it might have more than 1 hybridization. But let's take a look at a simple way to determine the hybridization for a central atom. And it's really quite simple. You want to take the number of sigma bonds that are attached to that central atom, and you add the number of unshared electron pairs that are on that atom. And when you do that, you're going to get a number that's between about 2 and 6. And so here is how you determine that. If the sum is 2, then the hybridization is sp. If the sum is 3, the hybridization is sp2. If the sum of that is 4, it's sp3. You can have a sum of 5, and that would be sp3d. If the sum would be 6, then your hybridization is sp3d2. So let's do a couple of examples and determine the hybridization of some central atoms in different molecules. And these are some molecules that perhaps we've determined the Lewis structure of from an earlier lecture. So here's the first one. We have silicon dioxide. And so once again, we have to add up the sigma bonds to the number of unshared pairs on the central atom. Well, we have double bonds, and so that's a sigma and a pi, and there's a sigma and a pi. And so we have 2 sigma bonds, and the silicon does not have any unshared electron pairs on it. So that's 0 unshared pairs. 2 plus 0 is 2, and from the earlier chart, we said that means it's going to have sp hybridization. So that means that that silicon atom has sp hybridization. That's the first example. Here's another one. Here we have water, H2O, and we do it the same way. We know that the single bond is a sigma bond, and that one is also. So there are 2 sigma bonds here, but notice that we have 2 unshared pairs on that central atom. And so we have 2 unshared pairs. 2 plus 2 is 4, and so that corresponds to a hybridization of sp3 from the chart we had on the previous slide. So that means that this oxygen atom is exhibiting sp3 hybridization. And so that's the answer for the second example, sp3. That easy to see. Now, here's a third example. And this is a polyatomic ion that we drew the Lewis structure of in a previous lecture. We have the nitrate ion, NO3, with a negative charge. And we might remember that every single bond is a sigma bond, and so we have a couple sigma bonds here. There's a double bond, that's a sigma and a pi. And so we have 3 sigma bonds here. There are no unshared pairs on the central atom. The unshared pairs are on other atoms, but not on the central atom. So it's 0 unshared pairs, and 3 plus 0 is 3. And from our previous chart, we said that that number 3 corresponds to a hybridization of sp2. And so we can say that that nitrogen atom right there in the middle is exhibiting sp2 hybridization. And so based upon this lesson, hopefully you can determine the hybridization for just about any central atom in a molecule that you would come across.